Welcome to Canadian Dimension's podcast interview series. My name is Harrison Sanford. I'm the web editor at Canadian Dimension.
And my name is Clement Nokos, social media editor for Canadian Dimension. Today we're speaking with journalist Vincent Bevins about his new book, The Jakarta Method, Washington's Anticommunist Crusade and the mass murder program that shaped our world. Bevins was a correspondent on Southeast Asia for The Washington Post, on Brazil for the LA Times, and previously wrote for the Financial Times in London. Watching politics in the so-called Third World led him to write this book on a largely forgotten history behind one of the bloodiest massacres of the 20th century and the other misery it inspired around the world. The Jakarta Method digs into the American development of their anti-communist regime change program during the initial decades of the Cold War. The book covers the origins of the program after the initial failures of the CIA against the Soviet Union in Central and Eastern Europe that developed through trial and error with anti-democratic episodes of regime change in Latin America and East Asia forced by the United States. The domestic McCarthyite Red Scare had turned global, influencing U.S. foreign policy through actions based off of the domino theory that a country turning communist could turn neighboring countries also communist, and modernization theory that influenced how the U.S. handed out foreign aid during the 1960s. The culmination of this regime change program was the Indonesian anti-communist purge of 1965 that occurred after the spurious events surrounding the September 30th movement in Jakarta that led to the murders and disappearances of around 1 million people by best estimates across Indonesia, and the imprisonment and marginalization of millions more in the sixth most populous country in the world at that time. The resulting quote-unquote success of the Jakarta Method for U.S. foreign policymakers led them to share the same methods with right-wing reactionaries and militarists in other third world countries where leftists were finding democratic success. The Third World as a term today is usually derided due to its racial undertones and its association with the poverty of non-white countries. These countries are now typically described using the equally derisive developing country category. What is also forgotten, however, is that the Third World once promised the dream of post-colonial self-determination in an emerging multipolar world system just after the end of the Second World War. Neither Soviet nor imperialist, the non-aligned movement of the so-called Third World arose early during the Cold War out of the 1955 Afro-Asian Bandung Conference hosted by Sukarno, the first president of the newly independent Republic of Indonesia. The conference sought to increase cooperation between newly independent Third World nations against neocolonialism, representing most of the world's population, hoping to broker international relations between the two Cold War superpowers. Following the Bandung Conference, the United States would perfect the means to destabilize third world countries in the name of anti-communism, crushing movements for self-determination to align countries firmly with the West. However, in the early Republican era of the newly created Indonesian nation, Soviet-style communism was never a real threat to U.S. interests. In fact, early Southeast Asian communists appealed to American values in their fight for colonial independence. The Communist Party of Indonesia, otherwise known as the PKI, was more so a democratic socialist political party in 1965, founded before even the Russian Revolution, and was largely unarmed. In most third world countries where communist or other leftist movements did not organize armed resistance, the military held the clear monopoly of violence. This is perhaps one reason why the violence that occurred around the 1965 massacre could happen so easily. Jakarta became a call sign for anti-democratic forces across the Third World in the years immediately after the massacre. Military coups across Latin America, most famously against Salvador Allende's democratic socialist government in Chile, used the Jakarta Method to full effect. Operation Condor, a U.S.-backed anti-communist terror campaign across South America, was directly influenced by Indonesia's 1965 anti-communist purge.
Bevins has written a well-researched history of how the American campaign against third world democracy shaped the geopolitics of our world today. And with that, we'd like to welcome Vincent Bevins to Canadian Dimension.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
So first, we'd like to ask, what exactly is the Jakarta Method?
So the Jakarta Method is the intentional mass murder of leftists or accused leftists in the Cold War, and this was done for a specific purpose, in the service of constructing authoritarian capitalist regime. So That's the short answer, that the Jakarta Method is getting rid of enemies of the growing sphere of U.S.-led capitalist hegemony in the 20th century by rounding them up and killing them. And that's not killing them in war, but killing them through state terror, through the intentional execution of civilians. Now, why is it called the Jakarta Method? The most important event in this story, the story of mass murder of leftists in the Cold War, but not the first event, is the 1965 massacre of approximately 1 million innocent civilians in Indonesia. Now, this was the apex of this method, and it was such an obvious success to the West and to potential allies of the United States and to far-right movements around the world that they took inspiration from it, copied it. And in my book, I found that there's at least 20 cases in the Cold War in which U.S. allied countries intentionally exterminated large numbers of leftists or accused leftists. And in not all of these cases, but a lot of them, the word Jakarta was used to signify what they were going to do or what they were doing or what they were threatening to do. The most important examples being Chile and Brazil, countries that I also had a lot of experience with in addition to my time spent in Indonesia. So while what I'm calling the Jakarta Method actually starts before the 1965 Indonesian Massacre, I use this trope that develops on the global far right after the 1965 massacre to give name to a tactic that was employed widely and to great consequence in the Cold War, and that is the intentional execution of innocent leftists.
So why write this kind of book, and why write it when you did?
There's a few answers. Some have to do with me and some have to do with the history that's emerged. As far as I'm concerned, I was working as a foreign correspondent in Brazil for the Los Angeles Times from 2010 to 2016. And then I moved to Southeast Asia, based in Jakarta, to cover that region for the Washington Post in 2017. Now, I found two things when I got there related to my work. One was that the story of the murder of 1 million people in 1965 lurked below the surface in absolutely every other story that I did in Indonesia. It was behind everything. It was one of the most important formative events in that country and in the region. And back in the West, when I would talk about this, nobody knew about this. Or if they heard about this, they knew the slightest bit, but they were shocked to find out what it really meant and how important it really was. And as I outlined in the book, that I think this is probably the largest victory for the West and the construction of a global capitalist system in the Cold War, far more important than Vietnam, for example. So that was one, is that I realized, oh, wow, people really don't know about this, and people are telling me, what is that, right? Part two, I realized there was a connection to Chile, Brazil, and other Latin American countries where I just, through luck of life experience, had contacts, had language experience, and I thought, okay, this could be a way that I could come at this story to try to get it told, try again to get it told, because, a lot of people have told it over the decades, and a lot of academics and Indonesian activists have done a lot more heroic and important work than I have in this effort. But I thought this was a way that I could do it. And then number three, we got more declassified files. So Bradley Simpson, a very important historian in the United States for the reconstruction of this story, came out with a new set of formerly secret State Department files in 2017. He shared those with me, and he made it clear that he would be very willing to help in whatever else I were to do. And so these files made it possible to tell even more of the story than had ever been possible, although there are still big gaps in what we know. And I went to the CIA and I asked them, what did you do in the early 1960s? Where are your files? And, of course, they didn't answer me. But that's really what it was, is that I thought I realized how understood this is in the English-speaking world. And I thought I had maybe a shot to come at it from a new direction and hopefully get the word out to a new group, to a new segment of people.
Right. And following up on that, I mean, you've written that the truth of what happened in 1965 and 1966 contradicts so forcefully our idea of what the Cold War was, that it's been easy to forget about the violence that shaped Indonesia and much of the global South in the latter half of the 20th century. So in your opinion, why are the ghosts of that bloody period still with us today?
Yeah, I think that's a really important phenomenon to take into account. in explaining why people know so little about Indonesia compared to, say, the Vietnam War or the Bay of Pigs or the Korean War or all these other flashpoints of the Cold War, which were less consequential in terms of human life and really in terms of the outcome. Some of the explanations are sort of bread and butter, like, oh, well, Vietnam became a domestic issue in the United States and American lives were lost, so that took precedent, for better or worse, in the Western imagination. But also, I think the other half of the story, you have to confront the fact that when a narrative has sort of hegemony, facts that directly contradict that narrative have a hard time emerging. It's not through sort of active suppression or censorship or whatever. It's just that, this story gets told a little bit and it kind of falls away because people don't know how to integrate it into the larger story they tell themselves about the 20th century. So I think that has to be a big part of why we don't know about, we being sort of the mainstream audience in English-speaking North America, about a lot of the worst things that we did. I mean, for a very long time, there was a lot of people invested in making sure that the United States presented the best version of itself to the world. I think there still are a lot of people, but during the Cold War especially, this was an explicit propaganda mission of the most powerful government in human history. And this sort of stuff certainly did not help. So while I don't think it was like hidden away explicitly, it gets told a little bit and then it gets forgotten and never told again. And then, the third reason is that Suharto, the murderous dictator that took over as a result of the mass killings, and was immediately welcomed into the community of most favored nations, into the quote unquote free world, and showered with U.S. aid and with and was given all kinds of investment capital from Western corporations. He was incredibly successful in actually suppressing the truth of what happened. So it only came out drip by drip. The extent to which he was really lying in 1965 and 1966 about what happened. It's still illegal to this day to do anything that can be considered by the courts a quote-unquote offense of communism. So the dictatorship that he set up and the sort of successor regime, which is a democratic order, but still very much has continuity with the military-led order that came before, made it impossible to talk about what really did happen. And then it's not a coincidence that a lot of books about this are written by Westerners, not because Westerners know more, but because we sort of have the privilege to do so without the risk of being thrown in jail or losing, or there being repercussions for our families in Indonesia, or having professional consequences. So I think that's a sort of an overview of all the reasons, but I think the one that is most disturbing is the one that you mentioned, is the one that we sort of tend to forget the things that fly in the face of what we like to believe about ourselves.
And that's true. And reading the book, you're constantly reminded as well of the implications of all of this violence in living memory on the contemporary world. And so my next question is really, I wanted to ask you, how does this forgotten past better explain some of the stranger parts of our present, like how right-wing reactionaries are elected in some of the world's biggest countries, like Brazil, India, Russia, rather democratically, to the surprise of liberal Democrats in the Western world?
Yeah, so I argue that this violence, especially the 1965 massacre, which was a major turning point in the Cold War, but also all the other times that authoritarian capitalist regimes established themselves via the physical elimination of their enemies, that these phenomena really shaped the world that we inhabit today, perhaps to such a large extent that it's really even hard to look or feel those consequences around us, because it's like a fish in water. Does a fish know that he's wet? It's everywhere. But you point rightly, I think, to some of the more bizarre and obvious examples. And Jair Bolsonaro, in the country that I've been in for most of this year, is a really obvious example. He's like a direct resurrection of the political legacy that says we need to kill the left. The only way to move forward as a nation is to murder leftists. And he said this many times throughout his political career. He said at one point, we need to do what the dictatorship refused to do, kill 30,000 people. It doesn't matter if they're innocent. And that's sort of like the tip of the iceberg. That's the really obvious long-term, the long tail of the Jakarta Method. But in a broader, more banal sense, in almost all of the global south, you have the maintenance of a semi-feudal distribution of resources, a quasi-oligarchical system, which is not only not what the peoples of the colonized world thought that they would build by now, it's not even what capitalist ideologues say is supposed to happen when you develop. I mean, it's like a almost a stillborn capitalism dominated by a small crony class and the extreme concentration of natural resources that in many cases was preserved by the elimination of leftists or soft social democrats or just sort of moderate liberals. In the Cold War, justified by anti-communism, right? So a lot of leaders that came up in the 40s and 50s and 60s in the global south, or the third world as they called it at the time, in a very forward-looking and optimistic project. They came up thinking, okay, either we need to, not thinking exactly, they came up affirming either we need to move from feudalism to capitalism, and that was all, but doing that in a way that threatened U.S. interests could get you subjected to regime change or worse. Others thought, oh no, the new post-colonial order should be a more socialist or more social democratic order, and this is more the category into which President Sukarno, the founding father of Indonesia, falls. This also can get you removed from the world stage. Or you had explicit communist movements that were also destroyed for wanting to change the nature of the economic systems in these newly liberated countries. And usually what happened after U.S.-backed violent regime change or the imposition of the Jakarta Method was the maintenance of a tiny oligarchical order that could be in close contact with the United States, leave the country's resources porous to international capital, and maintain some kind of a geopolitical position that was in direct contradiction to whatever it was the Soviet Union stood for, or sometimes they just had to say that, and that was enough. So I think to a really large extent, to answer the question, why didn't the third world develop? Why didn't the dream of a new constellation of black and brown countries taking their rightful place alongside Western countries, why did that not happen? Part of the reason is the violent repression of anybody that challenged the distribution of resources as it existed in 1945. And so a lot of this is blowing back very obviously, like in Brazil and in Jakarta, as I said. There's a museum, or as I wrote in the book, there's a museum there's a museum dedicated to the notion that communists basically deserve to be killed. So those are the really obvious examples. But I think that in 80, 90% of the world, you have a kind of crony capitalism, which is the kind of system that was put in place in 1966 in Indonesia, or in 1953 in Iran, or 1954 in Guatemala. Those systems, writ large, are still in place, whether or not you may have had the emergence of a small amount of formal democratic decision-making, such in Brazil. In Brazil, you still have the same economic system that you had before the U.S.-backed coup in 1964. You have elections every 4 years, but you still have basically feudal control of the Amazon, which results in staggering amounts of violence every single year. You have insane inequalities in the cities. And that was sort of the model that was imposed upon the quote-unquote free world, and it's in place. And then when the second world fell, when the Soviet Union fell, largely, it should be said, due to internal contradictions and to the serious failures of the Communist Party, the Soviet Union. It should be. It was not real. It was not because the United States made them fall. They sort of destroyed themselves. A lot of those countries, it could be argued, and this might be an over schematization of 20th century world history, but a really easy way to sum it up, I think, is that they fell into the same type of deformed liberalism that most of the global South has been living in since, like I said, 53 in Iran, 54 in Guatemala, 64 in Brazil. And then what you have left is a global order with a small cluster of countries in Western Europe, and I think Canada for sure is in here. The United States kind of with one foot in each camp, right? Like the United States is like partially still immature. It's still very rich per capita, but you could see it sort of slipping into like this quicksand of just becoming like a Putin-esque or a Brazilian style crony capitalist society. And then the rise of China, which was one of the few actual communist movements of the 20th century that set up sort of barriers at great cost to its own population, but barriers that would stop U.S. imperialism from destroying its socialist project. So I think I really ended up viewing the entire global system now as in light of this violence and the systems that it put in place for quite sustainably, right? Like these were long-lasting orders imposed by this violence.
How does media validate these general myths about the Cold War in the United States? So in Indonesia, you have that strange anniversary film that plays on the September 30th movement that propagates that myth as inspired viewing for today's youth in that country. And the history is largely forgotten there locally at the same time. And so your book talks about how American newspapers and other international outlets based out of the imperial centers during the mid-20th century helped to stir up the frenzy in Indonesia. So how are we still seeing that happen today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's the kind of thing where the nature of covert operations and the nature of a hegemon which routinely engages in secret regime change or disinformation or outright military campaigns ends up creating, right? It ends up creating a world where you don't really know what's happening until later, and that's unfortunate. But I think to trace this story to where we are now and give us a better idea of how to evaluate what might be going on now, I think it's important to recognize that in the second half of the 20th century, very often mainstream English language media kind of got a tip from the CIA or from the military, and it was sometimes they knew that it was kind of a lie, and they knew that they were covering the tracks of Washington, and they did it anyways. And Guatemala is really classic example of this. In the documents that I lay out that were declassified in 1965 in Indonesia, where there's one AP reporter that admits off the record to the State Department that he knows that the stuff he's being fed is a lie, but he reports it anyways. And I think the right way to think about the media's role in any country, anywhere, is that we like to tell ourselves that we're sort of outside human history, that we just like look at the objective truth. And I think that, aspirationally, that might be a good way to think about it. But if you're evaluating the situation objectively, media organizations are part of history just like anything else. So the American media in 1955 was American media in 1955. These were people that shared the assumptions of their nation. They had a specific concrete material relationship to the state, right? Concrete material relationship to the economy. They had their own unrecognized biases, and they had their beliefs that what the United States was doing was usually right. So when the United States government came to them and said, "Hey, we're doing this, we need your help," they often thought it was the right thing to do, because we forget that from 1945 to about 1975 with the Church Commission, the Senate inquiry that exposed some of the crazier stuff that the CIA did. In those years, the CIA was kind of troops, right? Like the CIA was treated by the U.S. media establishment as trustworthy, and if they ask you for your help, it's your patriotic duty to help them out. And the CIA doesn't have that exact role now, especially if they're talking about regime change stuff. You know, if the CIA comes to the Washington Post in 2020 and says, "Hey, we're trying to do a coup in Guatemala," the Washington Post is going to be like, "Whoa, you know, we know about this history." However, you know, the war in Iraq, did the United States government get a special hearing from the New York Times by nature of being the United States government? I think absolutely. I think there's no other way to look at that. The New York Times gave special credence to the state of the country that they operate in, and that is something that you have to sort of understand about the role of every country's media apparatus, is that there's never been a point when the mainstream media in the United States didn't act like what you would expect of the mainstream media in the United States, and I think it's makes more sense to see that as natural rather than some sort of a perversion, because they're always going to be contingent historically. The mistake is to believe them when they tell you that they are sitting outside of history. So it's very good to be skeptical of the outlets which very obviously have an affinity for, or a sort of an unstated mission to be the official outlets of the United States. The United States, for better or worse, is an actor on the world stage, and even when acting very, very badly, has tended to have the U.S. media assume that they are good by nature, because that's kind of the American way of looking at things. So I think there's a lot of examples in the first 2 decades of the 20th century where you can look at, okay, this dynamic has really been reproduced. Iraq is the most obvious one. All kinds of aspects of the war on terror, where the media has two choices: either believe the U.S. government or not believe the U.S. government. And when that's all they're given, they tend to believe the U.S. government.
You know, changing gears a little bit, you know, with the number of American regime change interventions throughout the 20th century, Operation Condor, everything else in Latin America, starting way before that with the Spanish-American War and early banana republics, and now with today's interference with continues in Latin America more explicitly. How complicit would you say a country like Canada and other Western nations are in this project? I mean, we know that Britain was involved in Indonesia via its conflict in the creation of the Malaysian Federation. And Canada worked all the time to prop up the British Empire throughout history. So would there be a diplomatic or military role for Canada in the 1965 genocide and the, you know, quote unquote Jakarta Method globally?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I wish I had a better answer. Interestingly enough, someone reached out to me on Twitter, and I'm gonna get wrong which exact. I don't remember exactly what the role was, but he said, "Oh, my grandfather was the Canadian ambassador to Indonesia at this time," and he's like trying to look into to the extent that his own family might have been complicit in this. So it's a really good question. I haven't looked closely at the Canadian case. I'm gonna try to. I really want to follow up with this guy and see what conclusion he comes to. But I think that in the really broader sense, you can say two things. One, Canada and Western Europe benefit often indirectly from global structures maintained or created by U.S. militarism. So there's kind of a weird free rider effect in Western Europe. In Canada, in certain cases, the role is much more active. So MI6, for example, really was wagging the dog in Iran. They really wanted the U.S. to do the coup in 1953, and MI6 was a big part of creating the propaganda that probably led to the clash in 1965 that ended up in the mass murder. In the case of Canada, I don't know. Do you? I mean, I'm really interested to hear what you think. I mean, to what extent do you think that Canada is usually or sometimes complicit in the kinds of operations I outline in the book?
With the way that Canada has operated, it is a product itself of the British Empire.
Right.
And so in keeping with those same interests, it's been known that, and also this happens in communique that you could also find through cables with the United States, that, and even especially with today, that there is strong cooperation. You know, it's seen in Canada that the United States is our number one security partner as well as an economic partner. The relationship is, not just because it's the largest economy south of us. It's the largest economy in the world. So with that geopolitical proximity, and also from where Canada is coming from as sort of this country invented out of the British Empire, I don't doubt that there's cooperation with the Indonesian 1965 massacre, that there is also, because we do see that today in the Western Hemisphere, that there is cooperation between Canada, the United States, and Latin America. There is some sort of complicity in the mid-century violence that we saw. Just not to get more into where Canada was there. I think that also deserves possibly more investigation, but there's definitely hints there. If people are saying to you that I recall Canada being somehow involved in this, then I think that it goes deeper than that in upholding sort of a Western hegemonic alignment during the Cold War in third world countries.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish I was just trying to find what he said, but yeah, I really want to ask this guy what he looks into. I mean, a lot of the, I don't want to. I mean, I could speculate. Just to make it clear, this is total speculation. I imagine that Canada was kept in the loop as to what was happening, but we're not really given a choice, and sort of were probably in a position to, like many other countries, a lot of countries in the world figured out sooner or later. I bet Canada figured out sooner because they probably had access to U.S. intelligence as to what was happening. A lot of other countries found out later, like the Soviet Union. So at the very least, the Canada did not stand up on the world stage and say, "This is unacceptable. What's going?" That my guess is that they got they were kept informed and sort of kept quiet. However, now that you ask, I really want to get back to this guy that told me that his grandfather was the ambassador and see what pops out. Well, no, he was saying, do you think it's okay? Well, this is interesting because he was like, do you think it's okay for us to talk on here? And I was like, I mean, for better, unfortunately, no one cares. It's not like the way that our sort of media and academic structure is set up is that I'm allowed to do stuff like this. We're allowed to have this kind of show. No one's, it's not. They know that it's not going to. It's fine. I'm like, yeah, just history. There's so many crimes of English-speaking nations in the 20th century. They don't, they're saying, yeah. I told them, yeah, no, man, I wouldn't worry about it, man. I don't think anybody cares. Yeah, I don't think anybody cares if the world finds out that Canada was partially, because, nobody cared when, the International People's Tribunal, they came out with a report. And so this is one thing that I think sort of slightly contradicts what I just said previously, just to take a look at both sides. The International People's Tribunal, organized in The Hague by survivors in an Indonesian academics, they found the UK and the US and Australia guilty, and they found the Australia and the UK guilty to a lesser extent, but they came to a ruling as to Australian complicity. They did not mention Canada, but when that happened, nobody, it wasn't like a huge story in the US and the UK. Just let it pass by, and that has historically worked, and since 1945, no matter how many times, did you see that Washington Post big series on Afghanistan that came out, I think last year, that was everything that they said was a lie the entire time. And then that's a bombshell for 3 days. And then 3 days later, everyone just goes back to publishing unsourced accusations from the U.S. intelligence community. What else? It just there's no way. That's another. Like I said, it's hard. It's hard to integrate information which doesn't fit the narrative. So you often get these bombshells in the history of of U.S. democracy, where oh no, they were lying to you about everything for the entire thing, and then it's and there's no sort of an uprising to change that, because how? What are you supposed to do really? And then 2 weeks later, the New York Times gets some CIA or NSA totally anonymous, unsubstantiated accusation that Russia or China or Trump did this, and they just print it because what else are you supposed to do?
Yeah, I mean, to excuse our Canadian friend over here, I think it's for a lot of his fears is a lot of his fear may be based on the fact that we have this maple washing of our foreign policy image. Canada is this last holdout of Western liberal democracy. We are better than America in this or that respect, which is sometimes true, and sometimes it's just yeah, you're kind of really overblowing it here. It's just as bad in many other regards. But to that point, I think, yeah, it is true that we're not innocent, or
Yeah.
Canada isn't innocent, but then also nobody gives a shit.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting. I mean, this, you look really good when you're standing next to the United States. That's, I think that Canada, especially in the U.S., I think probably everywhere in the whole world, Canada gets judged really favorably because it's next to America. So the fact that you like sort of have a decent healthcare system, the fact that there's like a tiny bit of on the case of indigenous peoples, there's no really, is it better at all in Canada? No, but just the tiny thing, the tiny little things that people can point to that are better than the United States, it goes a long way in the global stage because your neighbor is so like sort of in your face awful. Australia is really Australia is interesting because New Zealand gets like a huge pass just because it's not as bad as Australia. It's like a very similar vibe where it's like, because New Zealand's a little bit less racist and a little bit more put together, sort of like
It's New Zealand is Australia's Canada.
Exactly. New Zealand, that is exactly what they are. Yeah. As far as I've seen, the like extensive trial that was held in the Netherlands did not mention Canada. I think it's interesting to look into the Canadian side here because, as we've been talking, this is probably the worst thing that the West did.
So, you talked a bit about blowback in terms of what happened in places like Brazil with the recurrence of an authoritarian government, decades after the dictatorship. But what I noticed from the Jakarta Method itself, the book, is that it doesn't delve too deeply into policy blowback for the United States. The blowback of America's Cold War policy in Afghanistan, for example, is often analyzed because of September 11th. But, these policies, I have the feeling that they could have influenced the rise of radical Islamic groups and anti-Western terrorism in Southeast Asia as well. In particular, you have the example of Jemaah Islamiyah's 2002 bombing of a Bali nightclub. And Jemaah Islamiyah itself was created out of these radical Islamic paramilitaries out in sort of the peripheral regions of Indonesia. You kind of also have blowback in the book with the U.S. intervention in Guatemala in 1954 that led to the radicalization of Che Guevara, who then went on to help the Castros in the Cuban Revolution. But, I don't think that all of this could have happened without negative consequences for the United States, unless, we've yet to see those consequences or they've been sort of minimal at best so far.
So I think this is a really interesting and complicated issue because I think that the consequences really are long-term and subtle and not as easy to point to as something like 9/11, because what you have now is, as we enter the middle of the 21st century and there is going to be sort of the inevitable gravitational pull downwards on U.S. hegemony and the arrival of a new world order, or the arrival of many possible new world orders that the world's peoples are able to look at and think and decide between. They're going to know what the United States is. So the fact that U.S. hegemony was constructed this way, I think in the short term, actually was fairly successful for the narrow sectors of U.S. society that control the state. So, in a narrow short-term sense, you don't have a lot of blowback because things worked out for U.S. corporations and for the U.S. government. However, when we enter century 2 of a U.S.-led world order, there are dozens, if not over 100 countries around the world that have some kind of a story some sort of personal experience of what the construction of U.S. hegemony actually looked like. And that makes, I think, U.S. quote-unquote leadership in the world much less stable. And it makes it much more likely that the United States faces some kind of a collapse at a much more rapid speed than U.S. citizens would have liked. But on the other hand, I also the reason I kind of am careful about blowback as a sort of guiding narrative device or as the main analytical lens for the 20th century is that relatively speaking, objectively, concretely speaking, nothing bad happened to the United States ever. Ask a Vietnamese or an Indonesian or a Guatemalan or a Chilean if 9/11 was bad. And they're like, yeah, of course it was bad. But it's nothing, right? Like the United States didn't really suffer any consequences for any of this stuff. And certainly the ruling class that made, that put Afghanistan through everything that it went through. I mean, of course, the Soviet Union is to blame for that as well. But look at what Afghanistan went through from 1979 to 2001. The United States didn't go through anything, right? So a lot of, I think, sort of well-intentioned liberal accounts of U.S. foreign policy disasters or atrocities carried out by the U.S. government in the 20th century, they like to use this approach because it gets them out of the really thorny, it allows them to evade the really thorny question of, well, what happens if it worked? What happens if actually the United States government has succeeded in keeping down the countries of the global south and our citizens have benefited from it? It's a lot easier, and I think this is why so many authors have taken this turn to say, well, actually we're weaker because we did this, and the fact that we did immoral things in the Cold War led to our problems today, and it's very elegant, and it works very nicely to sort of work according to the, I think, deep-seated American assumption that like sort of morality always wins in the end. But what if that's not true? And that's a very scary and difficult question to confront. And so I try not to go either way. I just kind of say what happens. And I think that if you're picking what happens based on human impact and treating every single human life on planet Earth as if it is equal, which is like I say at the beginning of the book, the way that I approach the history here, the blowback isn't even really on the radar, right? Like, what do you got? One way to look at it is that, the destruction of Central America has caused the immigration crisis on the border. But how, that's not a crisis. That what it has done is the destruction of countries in Central America have provided waves and waves of cheap labor for the United States if it wants it. That's not blowback, right? 9/11, yeah. That was a huge and catastrophic case from the perspective of the national psyche. But if you compare it to the number of people that died in Indonesia or Vietnam or in Operation Condor, it's nothing, right? So it's a good question. It needs to be asked, especially for people whose more explicit job is to defend the U.S. national interest. And I as a journalist, I always sort of shy from that. When people shove you into acting like that's supposed to be your role, I always shy away from that. I mean, I have no problem if something that journalism shines a light upon happens to be bad for the U.S. national interest. My responsibility is not to, any country. And, if you actually work for the U.S. government or you're the kind of a sort of an organic intellectual of U.S. empire and if you really want to maintain U.S. power and you think that U.S. power is good for the world, or at least it's your job to maintain U.S. power, you should be constantly looking at the ways that blowback happens. But if you're just doing a sort of objective history of the 20th century, we just won. There was never any time when like the average person in the United States suffered from these actions we took in so many countries. However, again, like I said, in the long term, people have Wikipedia in the Congo. People know what's happening, and more as the world becomes sort of inevitably more democratic just through demographics, just in the sense that it's hard to maintain such an intense imbalance of political power for such a long period of time. That is going to be, I think, the long-term consequence. The peoples of the formerly colonized black and brown countries being like, no, we know what the United States is about. It's not what they say they're about. We like the movies, but like we know that's bullshit. We're like, I know, I'll tell you what happened to my uncle. I think that will be the long-term blowback.
And I want to follow that up with another question about allowing us to fast forward to maybe the present moment and ask, how have the anti-communist chickens of the 20th century come home to roost during COVID, so to speak, exposing the failures of the Anglo-American ideology of limited government and unfettered markets? It's like,
it's a really interesting phenomenon, right? Like, everyone that for 30 years was saying like, hey, I think neoliberalism leaves the state, crippled and unable to care for its population, they're all like have been proved way more right than they ever wanted to be in the last 6 months, right? I mean, the countries that are like really, really taking it on the chin are like the US, the UK, Brazil, India under Modi, right? Like, although, I don't think Modi changed the political economy of India. I think the Indian case is just a question of massive population and dire poverty. But the countries that are really doing worse than they should are the Anglophone free market, quote unquote, nations, right? Like, and again, this is something that everybody's noticing. And there's been a lot of really good commentary in like the Financial Times or like sort of the more properly global press as to the ways that the world, a lot of the countries of the world are looking at China and be like, look, we don't want to be like them. We don't love that system. But you can't deny that they're minimally competent with a small amount of resources. While here in the United States, as the result of the Reagan Revolution, and the Reagan Revolution, you know, and neoliberalism are coterminous, if not basically kind of the same phenomenon. This is a country with a lot of resources, more resources than any country's ever had, and they can't handle what is actually a mild illness that spreads quickly. So, yeah, I mean, that is another, you know, that I do think that I think it's not a coincidence that the United States adopted radical, fanatical anti-communism as almost the national, not religion, but the force that is propelling the nation forward in 1945. It's not a coincidence that is also the country that is the only one without universal health care in the industrialized world, right? I think you always sort of end up believing your own bullshit, getting high in your own supply. And like in the US, I think that we sort of prohibited ourselves from doing things that any other a state not infected with this fanatical anti-communism would have done. And yeah, this has real consequences. I mean, this not only has consequences for the thousands of people dying in the United States, but for the geopolitical balance of soft power as well, right? Everyone's noticing this. And everyone's also noticing that it's Bolsonaro, who's in South America, who is more pro-America than America. You know, people don't get how much, like if you go to a Bolsonaro march in Brazil, well, if you see somebody waving a U.S. flag in South America, they're right wing, right? And if you see someone waving a U.S. flag in Brazil, they're a Bolsonarista. And if you tell that to Americans, like, what are you talking about? Bolsonaro's like, he's off the charts. He's a far right apologist for dictatorship and authoritarianism. But in the South American context, like that is the legacy of U.S. foreign policy. He is the direct descendant of 20th century interventions in South America. So yeah, everybody's noticing that it's the people that most loudly decried social democracy and treated social democracy or socialism as if it were satanic that are now unable to stop people from dying all over their country.
Yeah, and I think that actually goes into a lot of like what you just mentioned with the United States, or how the United States is perceived in a place like Brazil. Like in Indonesia, Obama is God, right? Because
you go on. I'll tell you. I'll probably add some.
Like he is a son of Jakarta.
Right.
Like he is Indonesian if it were up to the Indonesians. And so like with that, you know, perception, you know, it goes into it's something that Westerners don't seem to understand, like from the perspective of these third world countries, like how these anti-communist programs were so successful then in kind of forming this local public perception of the United States. In their alignment, that alignment has to come with some sort of positive perception of this global superpower.
Yeah, Indonesia is really interesting because on the one hand, Obama is like, yeah, everyone loves him because like he looks like he could have grown up in Jakarta, and he did. And I saw him speak in Jakarta, actually covered it when he came through town, and like he's like knows Indonesian, like, you know, he probably couldn't, you know, give a lecture, but he dropped like some jokes and some phrases and everyone went wild. And yeah, Suharto was a really, you know, imported. His economists were trained in the United States. The military was trained in the United States. It was a pro-U.S. dictatorship. That was the deal, right? You know, that was the deal in a lot of Southeast Asia. Same thing with the Philippines. You just pretend that you love America. Let America be really involved in all of your decision making. Pretend that everything is about destroying communism, and you get the backing of the world superpower. However, this is interesting. The one aspect in which there has been anti-U.S. quote unquote blowback in the United States is the war on terror. So the one thing that people will use as a reason to decry the United States, and especially in 2001, is the treatment of Palestine or the treatment of Iraq, you know, because Indonesia, it's not a more Muslim country than it used to be, but there's a lot more radical Islamists than there would have been, I think, without the 1965, 1966 violence. And a lot of them were very anti-Western because what they really care about is global Islam. But no, absolutely. I mean, in Bolsonaro, he's not a big thinker, right? Like he didn't choose to be pro-America. He doesn't like have that much presence of mind to even think about that kind of stuff. He just came up in a military dictatorship where that was who you see. He got in big trouble for this. Intercept Brazil, which does really great work, by the way, published a video where he at this bizarre conference where he was saluting the American flag, and that's the natural almost formation of a Brazilian military officers that came up in the dictatorship. You establish real hegemony, and then on the other hand, on the other side of the coin, the left in South America views the U.S. as a really malevolent force. Not because they read about it in sort of Noam Chomsky, but because their cousin or grandmother might have been tortured, killed, and thrown out of a helicopter. So it's very hard for, I think, U.S. citizens, and I think sort of through no fault of their own very often. I'm thinking of sort of my own family, people that haven't had the luck to be able to travel around and have the kind of job that I had for the last 15 years to just not really get a sense of this stuff having happened at all. I mean, it's hard enough to run a democracy when you have to make decisions on policy in one country. It becomes nearly impossible when you're actually an empire and you're expected to know about U.S. activities 180 countries, right? Which is, I think, why democracies probably shouldn't be empires. It ends up being putting a mental and psychological strain on the citizens that is sort of almost impossible to take on. Unless you're sort of a full-time expert in U.S. foreign policy, you're going to be unaware of what's been going on and what's going on right now. I mean, I'm sure there's 15 or 20 countries right now where you could say, well, did you know this is happening and the U.S. is doing it? And I would say no. I mean, because I've been concentrating on 1945 to 1990 and 25 other countries. It's impossible to keep up with, and it's hard to have true democracy in a situation like that.
Going back to this comparative history almost between what's happened in Latin America and in Indonesia, without the history of anti-communism in Indonesia, just switching gears here to focus more on kind of the local aspects of what led to the Indonesian case being millions killed and millions more imprisoned versus what happened in other places where death tolls were maybe in the thousands or tens of thousands. You have in Latin America more of a culture of reconciliation, let's say,
right,
with the United States' interventions. In Indonesia, this isn't really happening.
Right.
Unlike the settler or mestizo countries in Latin America, their anti-colonialism could be attributed more to kind of nation-state characteristics, like everyone speaks Spanish, or they have more well-developed states that came out of the Spanish or Portuguese empires. Right. Indonesia is pretty much a fake country in the sense that it's entirely constructed as the Benedict Anderson archetypical imagined community. Right. When Benedict Anderson is coming up with this thing that's cited by all these social scientists, it's really Indonesia that he's referring to, that concept, right, of nationalism. Right. So the reaction against the third world took place really during Indonesia's national infancy. And so with this weak state, with this weak sense of nation, nobody speaks, there's 100 million people and nobody speaks the same language. Could you say
11% spoke Bahasa in 1945, spoke Bahasa in Indonesia? Yeah.
And so many were also at the time illiterate. Right. You couldn't even really use print capitalism to the strongest extent because nobody could really read. Mm-hmm. So could you say that with that, comparing the situations in Indonesia and in Latin American countries, that it was easier then to enact such a widespread massacre compared to other anti-communist extermination programs elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, so the question of why it was that there were so many more dead in Indonesia compared to countries in Latin America is a really good one. And I think I have two sort of main answers. One being that you actually needed to kill that many people in order to consolidate the dictatorship that Suharto ended up being successfully taking over. And two, I think sort of anti-Asian racism in the United States. So I think it would have been very hard to kill 1 million people in Mexico. It would have been, even though there's obvious racism towards Latinos, it was easier for U.S. foreign policy officials and easier for U.S. journalists to wash their hands of racism in Southeast Asia, where they were like, oh, they quite literally said this in the New York Times. They're different. That life is cheap over there, and they're inherently violent. But the first one, the fact that it was necessary, I think is usually misunderstood. when we talk about right-wing terror in the Cold War, because often the narrative is that, oh, the U.S. made alliances with these bad guys, and these bad guys went sort of went wild and ended up killing a bunch of people for no reason or out of vengeance, or it was a mistake. It was incidental to the order that was being constructed, whereas the violence was constitutive of the order that was being constructed. And the people overseeing this violence very often knew this. It's not easy to kill people. I don't want to, to be graphic or whatever, but if you just think about sort of what it actually means to stab or shoot someone to death, it's very difficult logistically, psychologically. People don't go and just sort of do this kind of thing endlessly for no reason. And in the case of Chile and Indonesia are sort of good. We have evidence which is, I think, useful for comparison. The head of Pinochet's secret police bragged that he only had to kill a few thousand people. That made him sort of more efficient than the Argentines, who ended up having to kill tens of thousands to consolidate their regime, because they understood very clearly their job was to make sure that the authoritarian capitalist order they were constructing was stable. And so if you could kill enough people in a terrifying enough way that everybody else would shut up and never talk about this ever again and be too scared to stand up to the regime, too scared that they would lose another family member, too scared. I mean, the use of disappearances is especially horrible because you're scared that you're led to believe that maybe your relative is still alive, but so you're too scared to do anything, thinking that might be what kills them. He bragged that he was able to stop. Now, in the case of Indonesia, why was it that was 1 million was the number that was actually quote unquote necessary? Well, 25 to 30% of the Indonesian population was either in or directly affiliated with the Communist Party. This was not a sort of minority guerrilla group. This was not a group of intellectuals operating underground. This was a huge, well-organized, non-violent moderate party that had done very well in democratic elections. And if you had just sort of taken over and said, we're in charge now, it wouldn't have worked, right? So if you notice, and you mentioned Benedict Anderson, who I want to get to in a second. He was very influential in establishing one key part of the story, and he was kicked out of Indonesia before he was even able to do so. But he ended up finding the autopsy of the high-level army officers that were killed in September 30th, and he was the one that was able to prove that it was an explicit lie on the part of Suharto that they had been stabbed and tortured and things. But more later, if you sort of take a big step back and you analyze where the killings happened and when they stopped pretty soon after Suharto fully consolidated his regime, right? So the killings decimated the base of supports for Sukarno, decimated the Communist Party, which would have been the most obvious opponent to a Suharto-led regime, and they happened in parts of the country where support for Sukarno was highest. So they made possible the consolidation of the dictatorship. And once Suharto fully formally takes over, he has recognition in the United States. Sukarno sort of really officially given up, although he's been sort of half given up already. That's when the killing stops. And so you have just a much larger country, which a much larger and much further, much better established left-wing party coinciding with U.S. willingness to tolerate horrible massacres because of geographic location. I think that adds up to why Indonesia was 1 million, whereas in South America was quote unquote only. I mean, it sounds crazy to say only, but tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands in Central America. Now, the question of nationalism is really interesting, right? Because when I got to Southeast Asia and I would talk to my friends back in Brazil, for example, they would say, "Oh, what language do they speak in the Philippines?" I'm like, "Well, that's a very Western Hemisphere question. Like, there's not, like, a lot of countries in Southeast Asia still have not established the level of national identity or linguistic unity that Indonesia even had in 1965. So by the standards of Southeast Asia, Sukarno was phenomenally successful in creating some level of cohesion among what were really just 15,000 islands that all had happened to be conquered by the Dutch. I mean, there was hundreds of ethnicities and languages. The only thing that held them together was the accident of Dutch colonialism. And if you go like to the bits of the islands where Indonesia becomes the Philippines, it's a really fascinating study in the sort of effects of
this sort of transnational thing between islands. They're connected. They're not divided by water, but connected by water.
Yeah, exactly. And if you get to the bit like the very northeast of Indonesia where it starts to become the Philippines, it becomes really clear, like, oh, like these were basically the same ethnic and linguistic group before colonization, but now you have radically different cultural and religious traditions as a result of Spanish versus Dutch colonization. Now, I think you're also right to point to a third thing, which is not something I've looked at that I haven't spent so much time thinking about. There's just that, it was a really young and weak state, right? Like, it had been forged in revolution just 16 years earlier. There was quite a lot of allegiance to Sukarno and that was sort of identical to Indonesian-ness at the time, right? Like, Sukarno had really ended up forging a sort of identity was built around sort of left-leaning anti-imperialism, and a lot of the people strongly identified with that, and you'll meet a lot of Indonesians alive that remember that period and still identify with it. But there was a lot of people that felt, like, oh, we're not Javanese, I'm Batak, or I'm from Ambon, or I'm from this part of Sumatra that views Java as still sort of an imperial, sort of imposing their imperial power over the smaller islands. And I think that
that's why you still have like the most strongest paramilitaries are in places like Aceh. Are in Papua, where they're at the periphery, and so the central metropole governing them seems almost as distant as, say, Holland.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good thing to point to. This is a young country where nationalism the national identity is just barely being established. Papua, of course, being totally different because they were not considered Indonesian, and they're still sort of considered. Papuan locals are viewed often with a lot of racism and are subject to horrible abuses at the hands of the Indonesian government. But you're absolutely right. Like, it was easy to say, okay, yeah, you got this like new secular Indonesian ideology, which we all believe in, blah, 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 blah. But really, come over here. I'm going to organize you into a death squad under the aegis of an Islamic organization, which has been around for much longer. Your allegiance is not really to this new country, which has been around for, 20 minutes. Your allegiance is to, your village, or to this Islamic organization, or to your island, etc. I think that in some cases this facilitated the violence. But again, I have to want to stress again, like, it was where Sukarno was strongest that the violence happened. It was Central Java, East Java, and Bali, which tended to be the strongest basis of support for the most robust version of Indonesian nationalism. So I think that third one is really a key component of anything that happened in 1965. But it was also just that it was effective to get rid of those people.
You mentioned that the PKI had broad support, and so maybe this is why some reason that to kill millions was necessary. But if it's still millions, millions could the PKI itself was also an unarmed movement, but even so, millions is still a lot of people.
Right.
And this was throughout in places like Bali and places all across Java, and people don't all speak the same language. Right. I mean, you even had the PKI's Harian Rakyat, which you go through extensively, and that's printed in Bahasa Indonesia. Right. And so when these massacres, they seem to move like in a wave from Aceh to Papua. Over the course of that 1965-66 period, it's pretty easy, even if media was also controlled, telephones and telegraphs, I would assume, or other forms of communication still existed. And you could, from Jakarta, I would think there were people that also spoke these other regional languages and dialects that could tell their friends, like, listen, this mass slaughter is coming. And nobody seemed to get that warning. It sounds like in a lot of the interviews you conducted that people really just walked into it.
Yeah, a lot of people really had. They knew that something bad was happening, sort of in Jakarta, or maybe they knew that something in it was a tough time. But a lot of people really weren't expecting it to hit them. I think that was the case in a lot of circumstances. That it's not coming here. It's that has to do with that thing that I don't know anything about. Yeah, exactly.
And while in Latin America, you mentioned in the book as well that you have graffiti tagged everywhere that says Jakarta viene, or Jakarta se acerca. This is easily read and recognized by everyone, but you can't have the same graffiti in Bahasa Indonesia tagged up in Bali warning people that this violence is coming. So was there literally no writing on the wall for many? Like, in your conversations, did they not see that writing on the wall because they couldn't even read it, even if it did exist in 1965?
So the answer is no. Whether or not it had to do with a lack of linguistic unity across the islands. I'm not sure, but absolutely the people that I got to know the best, and I spent a lot of time in Solo in Central Java, lesser extent in Southwest Bali, and then met a lot of exiles around the world, Europe and Latin America and North America. Almost everyone. No, I never spoke to a single person that had any idea that this could happen to them. They always thought it was something. Even the people in Jakarta thought it was like, oh well, yeah, we're kind of on the margins of the left. Yeah, like we're active, but it's really like a palace intrigue thing. And people out in Central Java were like, that's a Jakarta thing. And people in Bali were like, that's a Java thing. And that's a really interesting counterfactual. What are the ways? Well, first of all, let me say that it's still really a mystery, to me at least, how this could really happen. How so quickly you could kill this many people with almost no blowback for the people that carried it out. It's logistically mind-boggling for me. I don't have a sense of really the organization and the amount of terror you have to inflict to pull this off. And I think that no expert would really tell you that we have a good sense of how it really worked. But I think it's a really interesting counterfactual question is, what kinds of things could have stopped this from happening? I think that there's really, unfortunately, I think the list is really long. I think it would have been some kind of movement in so many different directions probably would have been sufficient to stop this. It seems like it was staggering in its effectiveness. Not you've laid out one, but I think I could also lay out loads of other ways that this could have gone that would not have resulted in that much violence.
But yeah, again, continuing with the local cultural context of Indonesia throughout the Jakarta Method, I noticed that a lot of the victims, like the people who were murdered or disappeared themselves, were mostly men, and a lot of the survivors you interviewed were women. So throughout the Jakarta Method as well, there's all these gender dynamics at play in your history. Like from the CIA's attempt to make Sukarno seem lewd to it's lewd to them from a Western perspective, with
right.
the attempts to implicate him in this fake porno tape as compromat. But for Indonesians, if they ever actually did end up seeing this film, it would kind of make him more like, that man of prowess archetype of Southeast Asian political leaders. He was already known widely as someone who had several, almost dozen wives.
Yeah.
There's this misunderstanding with the West there. And then you talk about in the book, the Gerwani Women's Wing, they were implicated in the September 30th movement.
Well, they were blamed for it. Yeah.
They were blamed
they had
for
nothing
it.
To do. Yeah.
Perpetuated through this witch myth that
in a very gendered, a very, very gendered propaganda narrative. Yeah, go on.
And for such violence to be sexual violence perpetuated by women, for Westerners, that's something that may sound a little bit more far-fetched. It's not something that we see in the West here as something that happens on such a scale. But it was deemed real enough by Indonesians to stir up a mass murder. And so, for me, it's interesting to see these gender dynamics that characterize a lot of Southeast Asian political culture play out. You have a lot of women surviving and left to be pariahs in their communities after the killings. Men were more acutely killed directly, and women faced more of this chronic social exclusion. And we also never hear about women participating in the killings. Would you?
Yeah, I never heard that. Yeah, I never.
Yeah, maybe describe some of the effects of the events that 1965 and 66 had on Indonesian women, and maybe if you had some indication of how these sort of gender dynamics also played out in the killings.
Yeah, so I think you rightly point to the fact that you have sort of gender dynamics or the patriarchy in its like various forms at work in both the core and the periphery, right? So not only is the CIA like a very deeply Protestant male organization to such an extent that leaves them blind to dynamics on the ground at several points in the Cold War, you also have the use of deep-seated masculine anxieties in Indonesia to justify the mass killing. And I think that very few women will be surprised to hear that when they needed to really demonize the Indonesian Communist Party, they chose the women's movement as the embodiment of what was everything that was evil and dangerous about that movement. And even though the Gerwani, as far as we know, had absolutely nothing to do with the September 30th movement, they had nothing to do with the actual killings. The story that was told, and one that was very effective for the purposes of the Indonesian military that ended up carrying out the massacres, was that communist women could sneak into your house in the middle of the night and literally cut off your genitals. And this is a trope that comes up throughout the Cold War, South America as well. Often communism was seen as like an order that wanted to overthrow the true or natural state of affairs between men and women. Bolsonaro is full of these kinds of pathologies. And so you had both, sort of in the, to oversimplify, sort of the control room of the Death Star back in Washington, D.C., you had gendered thinking. You also had the deployment of deep-seated gender biases and gender insecurities in places like Indonesia and South America. So I interviewed a lot of women that survived. I interviewed a lot of men that survived too. I think I'm not sure why it was that women... I guess Francesca's the main character, and she's a woman, but it is also the case that women were killed. I think not as many were killed as men were killed. So you do have a situation where a lot of women were imprisoned, abused, tortured, and then released maybe in the late 70s, perhaps earlier, and they're still around to sort of to tell their story if they want to, if anyone wants to listen. But no, I never heard. I'm sure someone can correct me, but I personally never heard of stories of actual women participating in the murder. It was usually the military and the police that were sort of the overseeing the organization of informal death squads or informal sort of executioners that they kind of rounded up. And for whatever reason, the gender dynamics in Indonesia meant that those were men. But I think you're absolutely right to point to the gendered nature of decision making at the top. And also the very cynical and horrible use of existing misogyny and insecurities in service of the larger project, which I think which the book is really about, which is the construction of a U.S.-led capitalist order.
Well, that looks like all the time we have for today. Vincent Bevins, I want to thank you for taking the time to chat with Canadian Dimension about your new book.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was really interesting.
And where can folks find a copy of the Jakarta Method?
So in Canada, it pops up on Amazon or it pops up on Indigo. Sometimes one has it and sometimes the other doesn't have it. And then if you go to the jakartamethod.com, which is just like a page on my website, I usually try to lay out all the options for buying for those that want to avoid Amazon in the U.S. and they may deliver to Canada. I have an affiliate page on bookshop.org where you can get it there too. So, but yeah, anywhere you can find it. I always appreciate any way that anybody finds time to engage with this work. I'm really gratified that people have actually discovered it.
Thanks again to Vincent Bevins for speaking with us today. Follow Canadian Dimension on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and SoundCloud, and read more of our work at canadiandimension.com. Thanks for listening.